People often ask me to predict what will happen this legislative session. In fact, for the last 13 years, people always have asked me that question. So here are my predictions for the 2023 legislative session. Now, as regular viewers are aware, the Washington State Legislature is controlled in both houses by the Democrats. And while they don't have a supermajority like California or New York, they do have control of the agenda. Additionally, the Republicans did abysmally poorly in the recent 2022 elections. And that poor performance puts a kind of some wind in the sails of the craziest of the crazy elements who are going to be planning to do their worst this session. So while the Republicans can certainly have an impact, it will mostly be with their ability to stop or maybe discourage some of the worst excesses. And perhaps if they can kind of hold together, maybe they can provide some checks on the expenditure side. Maybe. Now, to do this well, the Republicans will have to be capable and effective communicators. They also must have the ability to message their concerns and alternatives well. Unfortunately, the Republican caucus in both the state Senate or the state House, they're particularly weak on the communication and messaging front. So it isn't enough to just say that you're not as crazy as the clowns in charge. You have to provide an alternative, and I'm not sure the Stockholm Syndrome that seems to be dominating the mindset of my Republican friends in Olympia won't just kind of paralyze them into a stupor of ineffective and depressed flailing around. We'll see. Now, I hope that I'm wrong about my concerns from the Republican side of things, but I'm usually too optimistic about these things, so I will be the happiest guy in Thurston County if I'm wrong about this. But before you wallow in your depression, certain that doom and gloom is just around the corner, and you kind of want to prepare for Armageddon, moving to Idaho, or the end of times, I will caution you that we've been in this place before. Things change. You can't predict everything. Bigger issues at the national and even international level can overshadow and completely change the direction of state-level politics. And this includes the terrifying desire of the D.C. interventionist crowd to drag us into some kind of world war, and maybe the continuing economic uncertainty that can also tend to overshadow the local political aspirations or agendas that people often have. We can only do so much to constrain the insanity in D.C. and at the WEF, so I realize it isn't looking on the bright side of things to pay attention to those guys either, but sometimes our local concerns just get overshadowed by national and international drama. But back to Washington State, on the Democratic Party side of government, which means basically the entirety of the bureaucracy, the governor's office, and both legislative houses, I expect a few themes to kind of dominate this session. And these are going to matter to everyone in our state, whether we want them to matter or not. Now, first, I can guarantee that the political class and their supporters are looking for more cash to squander, more of your cash. And this is the theme that really it just never ends. It is the natural tendency of government, bureaucracy, and the politicians who are always so generous with other people's, yours and mine, our money. So to find any and every excuse they can to squander your children's future, there's always going to be something or someone important or deserving to whom they can pretend to help, whether the cash ever does any good or not. Plus, there are special interests to reward and ensure that they support your campaign next time. So this bloat of government is a predictable and kind of inevitable result of the big government crowd. Now, just remember, tax and spend, or the more modern version I think that applies this year, which is squander and launder. When it comes to Washington State's budget this year, I believe the dominant theme is going to be squander and launder. The governor's proposed budget is the mechanism used to squander your cash, and the Democrats on the committees launder that cash to their friends. This is essentially how it works. Now, related to this, I expect the state agencies and every grant grifter in the state to kind of flood into Olympia, as they all do, probably most of them masked up. And with coordinated talking points, with assistance from the corporate media, they're going to be pushing hard to grab your cash, bloat the budget, justify their existence, and of course, rapidly defend their incompetence and predictable failures. So we're going into a long session, which will last 105 days, as opposed to a short session for 60 days. They alternate these sessions every other year. The biennial budget is a priority, and this means that the budget is for 2 years, and that's a priority for this session. So this is where the main cash grab is going to happen. Governor Inslee has already proposed a $70 billion budget. And this is about twice the size of the state budget before he lurched into the governor's mansion in 2012. So we're paying more than any past generation for the dubious privilege of supporting Inslee's kind of squander and launder agenda. But it is increasingly difficult to pretend that we're getting twice the value that we were 10 years ago. However, as difficult as it might be to defend this mess, you will witness the majority of grifters stepping up to the plate, and they are going to pretend the emperor has some amazing new clothes, and I expect that the tame media is going to repeat those talking points. That's what they do. Now, one big push, and this is something I think everybody needs to pay attention to, is going to be to justify in this bloated budget this kind of pretense that government plans to build or finance affordable government-subsidized housing. This is going to be a big deal. One benefit of the total failure to teach or even learn from history is that we get to make the same predictable mistakes over and over again that have been made for many generations. And now we get to keep making them over and over and over again. Of course, this time will be different, right? Because Inslee plans to go bigger than ever under the proposed Squander and Launder housing campaign. Now listen, I totally agree that we have an affordable housing problem. Much of this problem, though, is specifically and clearly caused by government policies that artificially bloat the cost of housing in the first place. Absurd and restrictive central planning schemes that are crafted to make new home construction complex and only for the wealthy, that's a big part of this problem. So let's pretend anyone in leadership in state government really wants to genuinely solve the housing affordability problem. Now, they could do three simple things. First, they could repeal the one-size-fits-all of the Growth Management Act that was passed back in the early 90s. This central planning failure did not manage anything well except to provide a massive excuse to increase costs, make housing only for the rich, punish the poor, and create a massive consulting, planner, kind of grifting parasite class. We can't get rid of them. Now, secondly, they could cut the absurd cost of self-serving greedy fees that are charged by government for really no value at all in return. Only graduates of Evergreen State College and bureaucrats believe that these absurd kind of nosebleed fees are not ultimately integrated into the cost of the home. In many cases, the cost of housing is hundreds of thousands of dollars higher on every home, just so that each part of the layer cake of central planning government can kind of get their cut. Now think how organized crime and the mob operates with their vig and kickbacks, and you're going to understand how these guys bloat their budgets on the back of homeowners. It's just how it works. But finally, the other thing is the recent insane trend of kind of jacking up the cost of rentals, both by destroying the rental market and making it impossible for small rental operations to survive in Washington State, is the most dishonest attack on the poor and affordable housing that we've ever seen in a generation. This idea of preventing background checks, making evictions impossible, and other kind of insane policies have depressed the availability of rentals and jacked up the costs of rentals because the owners of the properties have to recoup their costs or they stop providing rent and they just have to sell the property. Now, of course, none of these fixes will be proposed by the ruling class in Washington State. And it's not just because they'd work, but mainly because these fixes wouldn't create the opportunity to bloat the Squander and Launder budget that Inslee's proposed. And you can't buy your friends or your future campaign contributions without kicking out some of this cash. I mean, the inevitable failure of any of these subsidized housing campaigns to solve the problem is a feature. It's not a bug of the program. After all, this initial proposal is about $4 billion, and there is a lot more cash to squander where that came from when this first round fails and it runs out. So let's look at a couple of personnel issues with the incoming legislature that kind of hints at this scheme. And first, has anyone bothered to ask why Frank Chopp, the former Speaker of the House, is actually still in Olympia? Just a hint. It isn't because he likes the commute or the smell of the Olympia homeless camps and the drug addict camps there compared to his hometown Seattle's drug camp messes. Nope. It is because, though, he has spent the last 15 years setting himself up to cash in on his involvement with Lehigh, which is the so-called nonprofit, multi-million-dollar organization he manages and which has enriched both his wife and his daughter for years. Now, Chopp gets Inslee to squander $4 billion on affordable housing schemes, and then Chopp gets his friends in the legislature to launder the cash to his organizations, either directly or through local government grants or contracts, and it's got a sweet deal for a longtime insider and the final endgame for the long con of his government service. Another hint at this direction is the fact that the current Democrat Speaker of the House, Lori Jenkins, has removed longtime local government committee ranking chair Gary Pullett. He's from the 46th Legislative District in Seattle, and he's been replaced by someone far more amenable to the Squander and Launder program this year. Now, what sin did Pullett commit which required him to be excommunicated? Great question. Pullitt has actually had a belief in the principle of local control over planning, which is an unpardonable sin against the current regime. If there is one thing you can't have right now in Olympia, if you want to play with the big kids, it's going to be principles, and he has one. So it's very convenient and a potential obstacle to the Inslee-Jenkins regime agenda this year. So he's out of there. Now, as a little insider side note, most of the proposed bills, which are going to fill in this launder portion of this year's kind of squander and launder budget, have been purposely sponsored by the least competent and most ignorant of the Democrat legislators. And this is, I believe, by design. It is always easier to manipulate the ignorant and the crazy to do your bidding. And the last thing Inslee or those who are maneuvering to kind of grab his cash want is to have someone who might be able to actually think for themselves. So it's always best to manipulate the dumber side of the Dumb and Dumber crew to kind of do your bidding. And that's what you'll notice if you look in Olympia. Now, where's most of this cash coming from for the proposed squander and launder budget of 2023-2024? Well, it appears likely that much of it's going to come from the carbon credit scheme and the low carbon fuel standard scam that was implemented just last year. The cash collected through these hidden taxes, which every consumer is going to pay, are not subject to the controls of Washington State's 18th Amendment, which was crafted originally to kind of keep taxes collected from gas and other vehicle fees and then apply them to roads and bridges. And I'm kind of simplifying this here, but that was the idea in the first place. I mean, that's why these two cash sources were essentially consumer transportation taxes that were crafted in a way to avoid that type of very unhelpful 18th Amendment oversight. And that's very unfortunate. And yeah, I'm positive Inslee's going to say that's not the case. He's going to deny it, but he's not going to admit the truth about this anyway. And exactly which tame media person's even going to bother to ask him this question and press it? Yep, I hear the same crickets you do. Nobody. By the way, I mean, the supporters of these housing projects, they're going to try to pretend that they're doing something different this time. I mean, trust me, this time will be completely different. They'll tell us that, but of course it won't be, just like the subsidized housing in Russia, downtown Chicago, New York, China, or any other place that this is tried, it always ends in failure. And it's because that is the point. Just because they are funding triplexes or duplexes and they plan on destroying single-family housing in Seattle, say, or even though it doesn't make it functionally much different than the Cabrini Greens in Chicago, for example, which was the massive public housing projects that I also saw when I lived in New York City when I was a student there, or the massive public housing that's been built outside St. Petersburg in Russia. You know, they always promise utopia, always. They pay their friends to provide an overpriced, overhyped, low-quality product that really nobody wants, and while they chase out all the economical alternatives that don't require taxpayer subsidy. In a few years, they're going to be coming back asking for more cash to double down on the failure that they wanted to fund. I mean, that's just how it goes. And remember, this failure is just a feature, not a bug. Squander and launder. This is the point. These guys are so predictable when it comes to these issues. So there's going to be a lot more to talk about, I'm sure, in regards to this legislative session. But the big game in town will be the squander and launder game, this cash kickback scheme. And every insider is going to want to cut. For the most part, everything else will just be background noise to either distract you, distract voters, give the tame media something to write about, cut and paste into their articles, and then justify the existence of the too many lobbyists that we already have in Olympia. And don't get me wrong, I do expect big kickbacks to Inslee and Jenkins' friends, and I'm sure the teachers union, SEIU, and other government union bosses will get their cut. And I'm sure they're going to talk about disarming citizens because the rising crime wave is obviously making the average person less safe. And we do want to defend ourselves from the criminals, so of course that's what they want to do is take that away from us. So these guys are just unleashing more criminals, and the last thing they want is for us to defend ourselves. They're going to probably promote pregnant men, rainbow flags in every light post, solar panels, mobile baby abortion wagons. That's super high priority. Needles everywhere, lots of free drugs, and a bunch of other wokester distractions. But the real drama of the session is going to mostly be about the cash. How much and who gets it? So let's pay attention and don't forget what these clowns do. The future belongs to those who show up, and we need to pay attention to the Olympia circus, even if it feels like we're just watching a poorly scripted drag show on a slow-motion train wreck. If we can throw monkey wrenches in the gears of corruption, let's do it. And if we can expose the truth, no matter how ugly it is, let's do that as well. We owe it to ourselves, our neighbors, and future generations. So feel free to share with others if you like this video, and just leave me any comments below if you believe I really missed something. I try to read them all and respond to most of them. And thank you so much for watching.